1945, the year the world changed forever. The flags waved, the bands played, and headlines shouted victory. America had emerged as the triumphant superpower, the savior of freedom, the hero who ended the deadliest war in human history. But behind the victory parades and patriotic songs lies another story, a story buried beneath the rubble of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whispered in the corridors of secret labs, and etched in the hearts of millions who paid the invisible price of victory. What if the cost of winning the Second World War was far darker than we were ever told? What if America's greatest triumph hid its most haunting moral questions? Decisions made not just on battlefields, but in war rooms where humanity itself was put on trial. Tonight, we uncover the dark side of America's victory in World War II. From the devastating atomic bombings to secret experiments, from the displaced souls of Europe to the quiet rise of a new kind of war. The Cold War. This is the story the history books often soften, and the one the world needs to remember. The spring of 1945 carried with it the scent of both triumph and tragedy. Across the war-torn landscapes of Europe, the final echoes of battle rumbled like distant thunder. The Allied forces, with America at the forefront, were closing in on victory. Cities that had once stood proud were now reduced to ashes. The roads were littered with the remains of tanks and the wary faces of soldiers who had marched through hell itself. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the end of the war that had consumed 6 long years and tens of millions of lives. For the men on the front lines, victory was close enough to taste, but it did not taste sweet. It was bitter, soaked in the blood of comrades and the cries of the innocent. In the final months of the war, American troops pushed through Germany, town by town, house by house. They met fierce resistance from soldiers who refused to surrender, men who fought on even as their empire collapsed around them. Every inch gained came at a terrible price. The fields of Europe were no longer green, they were mud and graves. Soldiers who had once been filled with the fire of patriotism now moved like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their hearts heavy with loss. They had seen too much. The ruins of entire cities, the starvation of civilians, the lifeless bodies of those caught between warring sides. And then, as they advanced deeper into enemy territory, they uncovered the unimaginable. The concentration camps. Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald. The soldiers who opened those gates thought they had seen the worst of war, but nothing had prepared them for this. Behind the barbed wire lay mountains of skeletal bodies, survivors so frail they seemed like shadows, and the stench of death that hung in the air like judgment itself. Men who had stormed beaches and faced bullets fell to their knees and wept. They realized that they were not just fighting for victory, they were fighting against evil itself. Yet even in that righteous clarity, the cost of victory continued to climb. Each step toward Berlin demanded more lives. In forests and villages, young men who had left home full of dreams were now reduced to names written on telegrams sent to grieving mothers. Over 400,000 Americans would never return. Their families received medals and folded flags, but no medal could fill an empty chair at the dinner table. Victory was coming, but it came dressed in mourning. Back home, America waited anxiously. Factories worked day and night, producing weapons and supplies. Families rationed sugar, gasoline, and hope. The radio brought news of progress, Normandy, Bastogne, the Rhine. But behind the optimism, there was fear. Every mother who heard the doorbell ring froze for a moment, wondering if this was the day she would receive the telegram. Every letter from the front was read again and again, the paper worn thin by trembling hands. The nation stood united, but beneath the unity was a quiet grief that touched every home. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, church bells rang and crowds flooded the streets. There was dancing laughter, tears of joy. The newspapers declared victory in Europe. But for the men returning from the front, the celebration felt strangely hollow. They had won the war, but at a cost they could hardly comprehend. Many were haunted by what they had seen. The lifeless eyes of fallen friends, the screams of civilians, the smouldering ruins of once beautiful cities. They came home heroes, but inside they were broken. The victory that the world celebrated was, for them, the beginning of a lifelong battle with memory and guilt. Those who had fought in the Pacific knew the struggle was not yet over. Even as Germany fell, Japan fought on with fierce desperation. The United States prepared for an invasion that could cost another 1 million lives. For soldiers exhausted from years of fighting, the thought of another campaign was unbearable. They longed for peace, yet peace seemed forever out of reach. In foxholes and camps, they whispered prayers for an end that would not require more blood. The final push toward victory felt less like triumph and more like survival. The moral weight of war grew heavier with every passing day. American bombers flattened cities to cripple the enemy's will, but beneath those bombs were families, children, and innocent lives. Commanders spoke of strategy, of necessity, of ending the war quickly. But for the pilots who looked down and saw the fires spreading below, there was no comfort in the logic of war. They knew that each bomb carried both duty and damnation. They were told it was the price of freedom, but how high a price could a soul pay before it broke? And still, through the exhaustion and loss, the soldiers pressed on. There was no turning back. They believed in the cause. They had to. It was the belief that kept them moving when everything else had fallen apart. They fought for their brothers beside them, for the promise of a world where their children would never have to do the same. And in that belief, they found a strange kind of strength, the kind that is born not from glory, but from sacrifice. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, and the smoke began to clear, the true face of victory emerged, not one of flags and cheers, but of silence and graves. Across the continent, cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and families were torn apart. Soldiers returned home, but the war came with them. In their nightmares, their tempers, their silence at the dinner table. They didn't speak of what they had seen, how could they? Words could not contain the weight of it. The nation called them heroes, but many of them felt only emptiness. They had seen the end of the world and somehow survived. In the grand halls of power, leaders spoke of rebuilding, of peace, of the dawn of a new era. But on the ground, the soldiers knew that peace was not a beginning. It was a wound slowly trying to heal. They had fought with courage and honor, but they had also witnessed the darkest depths of humanity. And though the war had ended, the echoes of their sacrifice would shape the world that followed. The spring of 1945 marked the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. The cost of America's victory was not measured only in bodies or cities, but in the collective soul of a generation. They had won the war, yes, but what they lost in doing so would never be fully recovered. The world hailed them as liberators, but they knew the truth. Liberation and loss had walked hand in hand across every battlefield. The victory they had fought for so fiercely had not come free. It had come drenched in sorrow, written in the blood of heroes, and carried on the weary shoulders of those who had seen too much and lived to tell too little. Victory had been achieved, but for those who had fought, who had watched friends fall and innocents die, victory would forever remain a word too small for the price it had demanded. The morning of August 6, 1945, began like any other in Hiroshima. The sun rose over the quiet city, the air was still, and children were walking to school. Men in uniforms cycled to work, mothers hung laundry, and the distant hum of warplanes was nothing unusual after years of conflict. Life continued in the fragile rhythm of a nation at war, but beneath the surface, something world-changing was about to happen. High above the city, at 31,000 feet, a silver American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay carried a weapon unlike any in history. A weapon that would end the war but also begin a new, terrifying era for humanity. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened, and a single device code, named Little Boy, began its slow descent toward the unsuspecting city below. 43 seconds later, the world changed forever. A blinding flash brighter than the sun engulfed Hiroshima. In that single instant, buildings vanished, steel melted, and tens of thousands of lives were extinguished. The air itself turned to fire. People on the streets were vaporized where they stood, leaving only their shadows burned into walls. Those farther away felt the wave of heat peel the skin from their bodies. Mothers clutched their children, screams filled the air, and then silence. The explosion released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. Within seconds, Hiroshima became a sea of flames. A city of nearly 350,000 was reduced to ash. The smell of burning flesh and smoke blanketed the ruins. Those who survived the initial blast stumbled through the wreckage, their skin hanging from their arms, eyes blinded, bodies unrecognizable, rivers filled with the wounded, seeking water that would both cool and drown them. The sky darkened with soot, and the earth itself seemed to mourn. 3 days later, on August 9, the same horror struck Nagasaki. The second bomb, code-named Fat Man, was even more powerful. The city's valleys amplified the blast, and entire districts vanished in seconds. Once again, tens of thousands of civilians, men, women, and children, were wiped from existence. For those who lived, the days that followed were a descent into agony. Radiation poisoned the air, the soil, and the water. Burns that would not heal, cancers that would emerge years later, and grief that would span generations became the legacy of that moment. The United States justified the decision as necessary to end the war swiftly, to prevent the invasion of Japan that might have cost millions of lives. The calculations were cold, but practical. Better for 2 cities to perish than for nations to bleed endlessly. Yet the question remains, was it truly the only way? Could the same message of power have been delivered without such devastation? The debate has echoed through history, a moral question with no easy answer. What is certain is that on those 2 days, humanity crossed a threshold it could never return from. For the scientists who built the bomb, victory came with guilt. Men of great intellect, who had once believed they were racing to save civilization from Nazi Germany, now watched their creation erase entire cities in a blink. Some celebrated, others fell into despair. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, would later recall a verse from ancient scripture that haunted him. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He knew that what they had unleashed was more than a weapon. It was a curse that would shadow mankind forever. Back in America, the news was met with jubilation. Headlines proclaimed the end of the war, the dawn of peace, the triumph of American science and courage. Crowds filled the streets once again, waving flags and cheering. Few understood the scale of what had happened, the suffering still unfolding on the other side of the world. To many, the atomic bomb was the symbol of victory. To others, it was the symbol of a moral wound that could never heal. In Japan, the horror continued for years. The survivors, the Hibakusha, lived with unimaginable pain. Their bodies bore scars that never faded. Their spirits carried the memory of a sky that had turned against them. Children were born with deformities, diseases spread quietly through generations. Entire families disappeared, entire neighborhoods erased, the land itself seemed cursed. And yet, out of that devastation, voices rose calling for peace, for disarmament, for a world where such power would never again be unleashed. The atomic bomb did not just end World War II, it began the nuclear age. The secret that had once belonged only to America soon became the world's obsession. The Soviet Union, desperate to balance power, began its own program, igniting the arms race that would define the coming decades. The Cold War was born not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the blinding light above Hiroshima. Fear became the new weapon. Nations built arsenals capable of destroying the planet many times over. Humanity lived under the shadow of its own invention. But the bomb also changed something deeper, the way the world viewed America. Until then, it had been the land of hope, the defender of democracy, the symbol of freedom. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it also became the nation that had wielded godlike destruction. The moral high ground blurred beneath the mushroom cloud. Could the liberation of millions justify the annihilation of thousands? Was the victory truly pure or forever tainted by the cost? History has struggled to answer. In the ashes of Hiroshima, survivors searched for meaning. A schoolteacher, her face burned beyond recognition, continued to comfort dying children, whispering prayers for peace. A soldier returned years later to the ruins, unable to understand how his nation's victory had brought such sorrow. Priests gathered in what was left of their churches and asked a question that has haunted every generation since. What does it mean to win a war when humanity itself is wounded in the process? The photographs that emerged shocked the world. Blackened corpses, skeletal buildings, the haunting silence of a city that no longer breathed. For the first time, people began to realize the true scale of destruction humanity could inflict upon itself. The age of innocence was over. The same hands that could build civilization could also erase it in seconds. Even among American soldiers, there was conflict. Many were relieved. The war was finally over. Their friends would no longer die in the Pacific. But deep down, there was unease. They knew something irreversible had happened. Some justified it as necessary, others could not sleep. They had seen enough war to understand that victory always came with a price. But this was different. It was not just a battle won, it was the balance of life and death forever changed by human choice. Years later, as the world rebuilt, Hiroshima became a city of remembrance. Monuments rose not for vengeance, but for peace. The Peace Memorial stands as a silent witness to the day humanity touched the fire of its own destruction. Every year candles are lit, bells are rung, and prayers are offered, not for anger, but for forgiveness, for wisdom, for the courage never to repeat that moment. The atomic bomb ended the Second World War, but it also began a new kind of fear that has never left us. It reminded the world that victory can carry a darkness that lingers far longer than the war itself. And in that darkness lies the question every generation must face: how far are we willing to go to win? Because once the line is crossed, once the fire falls from the sky, there is no true victory left, only survival. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is not just the story of two cities, it is the story of humanity itself. A reminder that power without conscience leads to devastation, that victory without compassion leads to emptiness. In 1945, the world witnessed both the end of war and the beginning of a new era of fear. The lesson was written in fire across the skies of Japan, and it is one the world cannot afford to forget. When the guns fell silent in Europe and Germany's surrender was signed, the world believed evil had been defeated. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and nations began the painful task of rebuilding. But as the smoke cleared, another kind of war quietly began, one not fought with bullets, but with secrets. In the shadows of post-war chaos, a hidden race for power was unfolding, and America was about to make one of the most controversial decisions in its history. That decision was called Operation Paperclip, and it would bring the minds of Nazi Germany into the heart of the United States. The story began as Allied forces swept across Germany in 1945, uncovering not just the horrors of concentration camps and battlefields, but also laboratories filled with advanced technology the world had never seen. Rockets that could reach the edge of space, jet engines decades ahead of their time, chemical weapons capable of mass destruction. These were the fruits of Nazi science. The same scientists who had served Hitler's regime, who had designed weapons of terror and conducted inhumane experiments, were now seen as assets in a new and emerging war. The Cold War. The Soviet Union was already capturing German scientists and engineers by the thousands, shipping them east to serve the Soviet cause. America, determined not to fall behind, made a choice that blurred the moral lines between victory and complicity. Under the cloak of secrecy, the US government launched Operation Paperclip. Officially, it was a mission to recruit scientific minds for peaceful research and defense. In reality, it was a calculated move to use the very architects of the Nazi war machine for America's future dominance. Scientists who had worked on the V2 rocket program, responsible for the bombing of London, were quietly given new identities, their Nazi affiliations erased from public records. They were brought to the United States, given homes, salaries, and respect. The same men who had once served the Third Reich were now working for the Stars and Stripes. Among them was Wernher von Braun, a brilliant rocket engineer who had built Hitler's vengeance weapons, the V2 rockets that rained death upon Europe. His genius was undeniable. Without his work, Germany would not have reached such technological heights. But his laboratories had been fueled by forced labor, men, women, and children from concentration camps, many of whom died from exhaustion, starvation, and brutality. Yet when von Braun came to America, those details were buried. To the public, he became a symbol of progress, the father of modern rocketry, the man who would one day help launch the Apollo missions to the moon. The truth of his past was quietly locked away in government archives. It was not just rockets. Chemists, physicists, and doctors who had experimented on human beings under the Nazi regime found new positions in American research institutions. Some had tested deadly gases on prisoners, others had studied hypothermia, pressure changes, or biological warfare using living subjects. Their findings, though born from cruelty, were deemed too valuable to discard. The US military justified it as a matter of national security. The logic was cold but clear. If America did not use this knowledge, the Soviets would. And in the emerging nuclear age, the price of falling behind was unthinkable. The scientists were settled in hidden military bases and newly formed research centers. Places like Fort Bliss, White Sands, and Redstone Arsenal. They were given American names, their families brought over, their histories rewritten. Some even appeared in newspapers, smiling in photographs, presented as brilliant minds helping build a safer future. Behind the smiles, though, lay a deep unease. There were officers, journalists, and citizens who questioned the morality of harboring men who had served Hitler. But their voices were silenced under the weight of secrecy. America was no longer fighting Nazi Germany, it was fighting communism, and in this new war every piece of knowledge was a weapon. The irony was stark. A nation that had fought to destroy the ideology of the Third Reich was now employing its scientists to protect itself from another enemy. The lines between good and evil blurred in the name of progress. It was a reminder that in the aftermath of great wars, morality often bends beneath the pressure of power. America had emerged as a global leader, but even leaders make compromises that history struggles to justify. Operation Paperclip would shape the 20th century in ways few could imagine. The rocket research that began under its banner became the foundation of NASA, the missiles that would later define the arms race. The intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads were born from the same technology developed in Nazi Germany. The same hands that had once built weapons for Hitler now built them for freedom, or so the narrative claimed. The truth was more complicated. For the scientists themselves, the transition was surreal. Many claimed to have been apolitical, saying they had only followed orders or pursued science for its own sake. They smiled for cameras, lectured at universities, and accepted medals of honor. Yet for the victims of the camps, for the families who had suffered under the weapons they designed, the sight of these men thriving in America was a wound that never healed. It was proof that justice, in the aftermath of war, often favors power over conscience. In the halls of government, documents were altered, files destroyed, truths rewritten. The American public knew little of these operations until decades later, when declassified papers revealed the depth of the deception. The shock was immense. The heroes of the space age had been born from the ashes of the Third Reich. The victory that had been celebrated as pure and righteous now carried the shadow of complicity. Yet it is impossible to deny the results. Without Operation Paperclip, the United States might not have reached space first. The moon landing, the satellite age, the very technology that defines modern life, all carry traces of that dark alliance. It is one of history's cruelest paradoxes, that some of humanity's greatest achievements were built upon humanity's darkest crimes. As the Cold War deepened, the secrecy surrounding these scientists only grew. They became essential to the military-industrial complex that fueled the arms race. Their research led to new missiles, new planes, new technologies of destruction, and while America projected an image of moral superiority, its foundations were quietly laced with the remnants of the very evil it had sworn to destroy. In the end, Operation Paperclip was not just a military or scientific mission. It was a moral test. It revealed how fragile human ethics can become when survival and supremacy are at stake. The United States had won World War II, but in the race to shape the post-war world, it made a pact with the shadows of its fallen enemy. The legacy of that choice still lingers, not only in the technologies we use, but in the questions we continue to ask. Can true victory exist when it demands the partnership of those once branded as monsters? Can progress born from atrocity ever be truly pure? These are questions that echo through history, whispered by the ghosts of the past, reminding us that power and morality rarely walk the same path. America emerged from the ashes of World War II as a superpower, but beneath the shining surface of victory lay the uneasy truth that the road to greatness had been paved with compromise, secrecy, and the genius of men who had once served darkness. Operation Paperclip was more than a hidden chapter of history. It was the moment when victory and morality parted ways, leaving behind a legacy that still challenges the soul of a nation that believed it had done only what was necessary to protect the free world. While Europe celebrated liberation in 1945, another part of the world was still drowning in blood. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the war was not over. The islands that dotted the ocean, from the Philippines to Okinawa, from Iwo Jima to Guam, had become graveyards torn apart by some of the most brutal fighting humanity had ever seen. For the soldiers who fought there and the civilians caught between them, there were no grand parades, no music of victory, only silence, smoke, and suffering. The Pacific War had its own rhythm, slower, crueler, and far more personal. It was a war fought not just for territory but for survival, where every inch of ground was paid for in blood. By 1944, the United States had turned the tide of battle. After years of relentless struggle, they had pushed back the Japanese Empire, island by island, in a campaign known as island hopping. Each victory came at unimaginable cost. The beaches of Tarawa, the jungles of Guadalcanal, the cliffs of Polillo, all became symbols of sacrifice. Soldiers waded through coral reefs under fire, climbed mountains through torrential rain, and faced an enemy who would rather die than surrender. The Japanese code of honor, the Bushido spirit, meant that capture was shameful. Surrender was unthinkable. Every battle, no matter how hopeless for Japan, was fought to the last man. For American troops, this created a nightmare unlike anything in Europe. In the Pacific, there were no clear front lines, no civilians welcoming them as liberators. The jungles were alive with hidden enemies, snipers, and traps. The heat, disease, and endless rain made every day a struggle. Soldiers slept beside the dead, ate when they could, and learned to live with fear as a constant companion. Many began to lose themselves in the chaos. The brutality of the fighting stripped away the idea of heroism. It became only about survival. Yet beyond the front lines, the greatest suffering often fell on the civilians. When American forces landed on islands like Saipan, Guam, and Okinawa, entire populations were caught in the crossfire. On Okinawa alone, more than 100 Zalozan civilians, nearly a third of the island's population, perished. Families hid in caves as bombs shook the earth. Mothers covered their children with their own bodies. When soldiers entered villages, they found scenes of heartbreak. Families who had chosen death over capture, convinced by years of propaganda that the Americans would torture and kill them. The tragedy was beyond comprehension. For the US troops who witnessed it, victory came with a sense of deep unease. They had come to liberate, but liberation often looked like destruction. In Manila, once known as the Pearl of the Orient, war turned paradise into hell. In early 1945, as American and Filipino forces fought to reclaim the city, Japanese troops refused to surrender, turning their fury on civilians. The massacre that followed left more than 100 Zalozan dead. The city burned, and rivers ran red. Churches became battlefields, schools turned into prisons, and entire families were wiped out in moments. When the fighting finally ended, Manila was in ruins. A capital city reduced to ash, its people broken. In the Pacific Islands, the line between victory and devastation blurred completely. The US used overwhelming firepower, artillery, flamethrowers, and bombs to root out enemy strongholds. Each assault left behind a wasteland. Entire ecosystems were destroyed. Once green jungles became scorched earth. On Iwo Jima, the Marines fought for 36 days to take a small island just 8 square miles wide. Nearly 7,000 Americans died there, and over 20,000 Japanese were buried in the same soil. The iconic image of soldiers raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of triumph, but for those who survived, it was also a symbol of loss. The mountain they stood upon was built from death. For Pacific civilians, survival meant living with the constant sound of aircraft and explosions. Fishermen could no longer sail. Farmers could not plant. Children grew up in fear of the sky. On some islands, entire communities were relocated or starved as supply lines collapsed. The war erased traditions, cultures, and ways of life that had existed for centuries. In the Mariana Islands, women and children dug their own shelters as soldiers fought just meters away. In Guam, families who had once lived peacefully under the sea breeze now hid in jungle caves, praying for the noise to stop. The Pacific War also left scars on the minds of those who fought it. Soldiers saw their friends die in horrific ways, burned, drowned, torn apart by shrapnel. Many became numb, their humanity eroded by the endless cycle of killing. The hatred between both sides ran deep. Propaganda had dehumanized the enemy, turning the war into something primal, something beyond reason. For the Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated to believe that surrender was dishonor, death became the only victory left. For the Americans, after years of brutal combat, compassion was often replaced by vengeance. Every casualty hardened them further. By the time the US prepared for the final assault on Japan's home islands, everyone knew what was coming. The Battle of Okinawa had been a grim preview. Kamikaze pilots, young men barely out of their teens, dived their planes into American ships, turning themselves into human bombs. It was both terrifying and tragic, an act of desperation from an empire facing inevitable defeat. The Americans braced themselves for an invasion that promised to be bloodier than anything before. Military planners predicted that millions, soldiers and civilians alike, would die if the Allies invaded Japan. That fear shaped the decision that would change history, the use of the atomic bomb. But before the bombs fell, the Pacific had already paid an unbearable price. For many who lived through it, the devastation had become a way of life. The ocean that once connected islands and cultures had become a graveyard. Villages were gone, traditions lost, and survivors haunted by what they had seen. Even after Japan's surrender, many islanders remained displaced, their homes destroyed, their lands taken for military bases. While the world rejoiced in 1945, declaring peace at last, the Pacific Islands remained scarred. American soldiers returned home as heroes, but the people of Okinawa, Manila, and countless other places were left to rebuild from ruins. Their suffering was rarely told in history books. They were the silent witnesses to the cost of victory. For them, the end of the war did not bring freedom. It brought the long, slow struggle of starting over. Years later, as veterans spoke about their experiences, many described the Pacific not just as a battleground, but as a nightmare they could never forget. They spoke of the smell of burning flesh, the cries of the dying, the unbearable heat. They remembered the faces of civilians, terrified, confused, desperate. Some said they had never felt joy in victory, only relief that they were still alive. The Pacific War was not just about strategy or territory. It was about endurance, about what the human spirit could survive when pushed beyond all limits. And for the civilians, their stories were quieter but no less powerful. A woman from Okinawa once said that after the war ended, she could no longer hear the waves without remembering the sound of bombs. For her, the ocean was no longer beautiful, it was haunted. A child who survived the burning of Manila grew up asking why God had allowed such pain. For generations, those memories would linger, passed down through silence, through tears, through stories whispered at night. The victory in the Pacific was one of history's great turning points, but it was not the clean, shining triumph that posters and speeches claimed. It was victory carved out of horror, bought with the suffering of millions who had no say in the matter. The Pacific's silent suffering remains one of the darkest chapters of the war, an enduring reminder that even in victory, humanity can lose a part of its soul. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945 and the Pacific conflict closed in August, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. But that breath was shallow and uncertain, because even as the smoke lifted and the guns grew quiet, a new kind of war was already stirring beneath the surface. The old enemies were gone, but a new rivalry was beginning to shape the destiny of nations. America stood victorious, powerful beyond imagination, its flag flying high across liberated lands. But with great power came great fear. The Soviet Union, once an ally, was now seen as a looming threat, and the unity that had carried the Allies through the darkness of World War II fractured almost overnight. Out of the ashes of global destruction rose two superpowers, each convinced they held the key to the future of humanity, and that the other must be stopped at all costs. America had not only won the war, it had changed the world. Its industries were booming, its military unmatched, and its influence stretched across continents. Europe lay in ruins, and the US emerged as the new guardian of freedom, the moral and economic center of a broken world. But behind the celebration, the mood in Washington was shifting. The atomic bomb had ended one war, but it had also opened a door that could never be closed. The secret of nuclear power was out, and it was only a matter of time before others possessed it too. In that realization, a new age began, not one of peace, but of tension, suspicion, and invisible warfare. The Soviet Union had paid a staggering price during the war, over 20 million lives lost. but emerged strong and ambitious. As Red Army soldiers occupied Eastern Europe, Stalin began building a wall of influence from Poland to East Germany, creating a buffer zone he called protection, and the West called domination. America watched with unease as communism spread like wildfire through war-torn nations desperate for stability. Europe had barely survived one tyranny, now it faced another. The ideological lines were drawn: democracy and capitalism in the West, communism and state control in the East. The war of bombs and bullets had ended, but the war of ideas had just begun. In the early days, America's power seemed absolute. Its economy surged while much of the world struggled to rebuild. Through the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars flowed into Europe, not only to restore shattered cities, but also to win hearts and minds. Bread, steel, and concrete became weapons in the battle for influence. Every road repaired, every factory reopened, was a message to the world: freedom brings prosperity. But for every reconstruction project in the West, the Soviets responded with expansion in the East. Nations like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania fell under the iron grip of Moscow, their fates sealed behind the invisible barrier Winston Churchill would famously call the Iron Curtain. The race for dominance did not stop at borders. It reached into the very heart of human knowledge. The same scientists who had built the atomic bomb now turned their minds toward new inventions, new weapons, new possibilities. America's triumph in science and technology became both its pride and its curse. Operation Paperclip, the secret program that brought former Nazi scientists into US research programs, had given the country a head start. Men like Wernher von Braun, who once designed rockets for Hitler, were now designing rockets for NASA. The line between victory and compromise blurred further as America built its identity not only on freedom and morality, but also on military supremacy. In 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, the illusion of safety shattered. The monopoly was gone. The weapon that had made America untouchable was now in the hands of its greatest rival. Panic rippled through the US government. If the world had feared another world war before, it now faced the possibility of annihilation on a scale too vast to imagine. The arms race began in earnest. Every breakthrough in weaponry demanded another in response. Each side built bombs larger than the last, capable of erasing cities with a single strike. Children practiced duck and cover, drills in schools. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. The fear of destruction became part of daily life. The birth of the superpower also brought new responsibilities and temptations. The United States began to see itself not just as a nation, but as a global guardian. It intervened in conflicts, supported allies, and opposed revolutions wherever communism threatened to take root. From Greece to Korea, from Berlin to Vietnam, the Cold War spread like a shadow, touching every corner of the earth. For some, America was a beacon of hope, defending freedom from tyranny. For others, it was an empire cloaked in righteousness, using its power to shape the world in its own image. At home, the new era brought both pride and paranoia. The late 1940s and early 1950s were filled with triumphs: economic growth, technological innovation, and the beginnings of the American dream. But beneath that prosperity lay fear. The rise of McCarthyism and anti-communist hysteria turned neighbor against neighbor. Loyalty oaths, blacklists, and accusations filled the headlines. The same nation that had fought fascism abroad now struggled with suspicion and censorship within. The Cold War had no front lines, but it had casualties all the same. Careers destroyed, reputations ruined, and freedoms quietly sacrificed in the name of security. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union advanced its own ambitions. It launched propaganda campaigns, infiltrated governments, and spread its ideology through education and art. Each side sought to prove that its system, not just its weapons, was the future of humanity. In this global chess game, every move mattered. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the first satellite to orbit Earth, it sent shockwaves through America. The race for space became the new battlefield. The sky itself was no longer a symbol of peace. It was a reminder of who controlled the future. Yet even as both superpowers competed for dominance, there were moments when the world held its breath, realizing how close it stood to destruction. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 would later become the defining example, when nuclear war seemed only hours away. But even before that, the seeds of fear had been planted in 1945. The atomic shadow that began in Hiroshima stretched across the entire planet, dividing not just nations but humanity itself. For many who had lived through World War II, the Cold War felt like a cruel irony. They had fought to end one war, only to find themselves living in the shadow of another that never seemed to end. The dream of peace had been replaced by a fragile balance of terror. Instead of soldiers fighting on battlefields, scientists fought in laboratories, spies battled in the shadows, and politicians played games with human fate. Victory had turned into vigilance. Freedom had become a constant struggle to stay one step ahead of annihilation. America's rise as a superpower was both its triumph and its burden. It became the world's policeman, the economic engine, the cultural leader. But it also became the world's target, the symbol of arrogance and dominance to those who feared its reach. The moral clarity of World War II had faded into the grey fog of geopolitics. Allies became rivals, enemies became partners, and the line between good and evil blurred once more. By the end of the 1940s, the map of the world had been redrawn, not by battle, but by ideology. The United States and the Soviet Union stood on opposite sides of that map, locked in a struggle that would define the next half-century. The Cold War was not fought to conquer land, but to control belief, influence, and destiny. The birth of the superpower marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. A world divided, balanced on a knife's edge. The same nation that had delivered freedom to millions now carried the weight of the world's fear. Its victory in World War II had made it powerful beyond measure, but that power came with a haunting truth. Peace achieved through fear is not peace at all. It is a pause, a fragile silence waiting for the next echo of war. When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke cleared from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, the world looked upon itself with hollow eyes. The war was over, but the silence that followed did not bring peace. It brought reflection, grief, and the slow realization that nothing, and no one, would ever be the same again. The victory celebrations in Times Square and the ticker tape parades across America painted a picture of triumph, but beneath the cheers were wounds that ran too deep to see. The soldiers who returned home carried stories they could never tell, memories that kept them awake at night, and a haunting question that echoed through their minds. Was it worth it? For the millions of men who had fought across foreign lands, the transition from soldier to civilian was a battle of its own. They had gone to war as boys and returned as men aged by fear, by the constant presence of death, and by the faces of friends who would never return. Many came home to the arms of waiting families, yet felt more alone than they ever had on the front lines. The noise of crowds reminded them of artillery. The silence of the night was filled with ghosts. Back then, the term, post-traumatic stress, was barely understood. Society called it battle fatigue, or shell shock, but no one knew how to heal it. These men built new lives while carrying invisible scars, pretending strength while haunted by what they had seen and done. The American dream that awaited them was bright but demanding. The nation was booming, industries were growing, and the world was rebuilding, but inside the homes of many veterans, silence replaced conversation. Fathers sat by radios or stared out of windows, unable to explain to their children why fireworks made them flinch or why certain songs brought tears. Wives and mothers watched their loved ones struggle to fit into a world that no longer made sense. The war had ended, but inside the hearts of millions it still raged on. Beyond America, the wounds were even deeper. In Europe, entire cities were gone, London scarred by bombs, Berlin reduced to rubble, Warsaw little more than ashes. In France and the Netherlands, people wandered through ruins searching for missing loved ones. In the East, the Soviet Union buried its dead by the millions, entire generations lost to the inferno of war. Across Asia, the devastation was unimaginable. Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in silent ruin, their survivors, Hibakusha, living reminders of the day the sky itself turned against humanity. They carried burns, sickness, and sorrow that would outlast their lifetimes. For them, victory was not freedom. It was survival. In the Pacific Islands, small nations that had been battlegrounds were left shattered and forgotten. Okinawa's fields were soaked with blood. Manila was reduced to rubble, and across the Philippines, Thousands of families mourned the unspeakable losses of occupation and liberation alike. These were the people history rarely wrote about, the farmers, the children, the mothers who had endured both sides of the war. When America celebrated victory, their tears fell quietly, unseen by the cameras that focused only on flags and fireworks. For refugees scattered across Europe and Asia, 1945 did not bring peace but displacement. Millions wandered through makeshift camps, stateless and uncertain of where to go. Jewish survivors of concentration camps faced the agony of returning to towns where their families had vanished and their homes were gone. Entire cultures had been erased. In the rubble of the Holocaust, the world saw the darkest reflection of humanity, and yet from that darkness, new nations were born, including Israel in 1948, a place for the survivors, though one that would soon face its own storms of conflict. While the United States emerged stronger, it carried a heavy moral weight. Soldiers who had seen the liberation of the Nazi camps spoke of nightmares that words could not describe. Some had helped feed starving survivors, others had buried the dead. The images of stacked bodies and hollow eyes followed them for life. They had fought to destroy evil and they succeeded. But they had also witnessed the depth of what human beings could do to one another. That knowledge changed them forever. Back home, the returning veterans found a nation in transformation. The GI Bill promised education, housing, and a chance at prosperity, and for many it worked. Suburbs expanded, universities filled with former soldiers, and the American middle class was born. But prosperity could not erase memory. Some men drank to forget, others buried themselves in work. Some spoke only to fellow veterans, the only ones who could understand. And in every town there were empty chairs at dinner tables, reminders of sons and fathers who had never returned. The psychological wounds of World War II were vast, but so too were the emotional and moral ones. America's use of the atomic bomb had ended the war but left the world divided. Some saw it as a necessary evil, others saw it as a step too far, a line humanity should never have crossed. Scientists who had built the bomb began to question what they had unleashed. Men like J. Robert Oppenheimer famously said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Those words echoed the fear of an entire generation, the fear that in winning the war, mankind had learned how to end itself. Even as the nation celebrated victory, new anxieties began to grow. The Cold War loomed, and with it came the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The very weapon that had brought peace now held the power to destroy it in an instant. Soldiers who had fought in the trenches watched as the next generation grew up under the shadow of the mushroom cloud. Children practiced hiding under desks. Adults stocked fallout shelters. The victory of 1945 began to look less like an ending and more like the opening chapter of a different kind of conflict. One that could never truly be won. For those who lived through the war, time became both a healer and a curse. The memories never faded, they only changed form. Some veterans found redemption in helping others, in telling their stories so that the world would never forget. Others remained silent until their dying days, carrying the burden alone. In hospitals and veterans' homes, the nightmares continued, and in the faces of their children, they saw what they had fought for, and what they had lost. The human aftermath of World War II was not measured in victories or treaties, but in the quiet endurance of those who survived it, in the strength of widows who rebuilt families from nothing, in the courage of survivors who chose to live when everything around them had died, in the resilience of nations that rose from ruins to create a new world, even when the past still haunted their sleep. The story of 1945 did not end with surrender. It began a journey toward understanding the true cost of war. The medals, parades, and monuments tell one story. The tears and silences tell another. The dark side of victory is not just the destruction left behind, but the weight carried by those who must live after it. For America, the end of World War II marked the beginning of its role as leader of the free world. But it also carried the duty of remembrance, the responsibility to never forget the price of power, the suffering of the innocent, and the moral questions that victory had raised. Every generation since has inherited those lessons, often without realizing it. The freedom, prosperity, and peace enjoyed today were bought with unimaginable sacrifice. In the end, victory in World War II was both a triumph and a tragedy. It saved the world from tyranny, but revealed the depths of human cruelty. It brought peace, yet also the tools of future destruction. And in the hearts of those who lived through it, victory was never simple. It was complicated, painful, and incomplete. Because while wars may end, the memories do not. The faces of the fallen live on in the dreams of the survivors. The silence of those who returned speaks louder than any victory song. And in that silence, one truth remains: no one truly wins a war. Some just survive it, and spend the rest of their lives trying to understand why they did. Black screen. Slow orchestral music swells. Victory, it's a word we celebrate. But in the story of World War II, it's also a word that conceals. Behind every medal, every speech, every flag raised in triumph, there are shadows we must never forget, because remembering the dark side of victory is how we ensure it never happens again.